Daniel, thank you very much for coming along. We look forward to hearing it. It's going to be a depression afternoon, I think. Hopefully not depressive. So thank you very much, and there we go.
Thank you very much, everybody. I was nervous following Marcus because I thought of potential overlap in our talks, and also that he would present it very beautifully and very thoroughly and with many interesting and broad claims, and indeed that proved true, so thank him for his talk. In a way, it's both a disadvantage going second, but it gives me a chance to bounce off some of the things you've already said. My talk is much more philosophical, really. I have interest in evolutionary medicine, but also in conceptual issues to do with what does it mean to say that someone has a disorder, and how do we know when normality stops and disorder begins, which is not by any means a straightforward problem, particularly in psychiatry. And actually relates to evolutionary problems as well, because what does it mean to say something's an adaptation, and when does it stop being the adaptation and it starts being the adaptation gone wrong or overly expressed or something. So these boundary issues arise. So this will be a sort of much lighter and more neurotic revisiting of some of the issues that Marcus talked about. And I would go further than Marcus in splitting up depression in a way that I think you'll see. So why are we even talking about this? Well, one of the reasons we're talking is that a major source of morbidity in all populations over the world is depressive disorder, this is just from the non-communicable disease collaboration data. Many thousands of life years are lost. Of disability, life years are lost to disability through depression, which is the blue bars there, and that's true in every continent we've ever studied, largely because people perhaps aren't hunter-gatherers in most of those continents. And if you add the red bars, which are anxiety disorders, then this is the major source of psychiatric and neurological morbidity. So that's why we're all here, right? Because there's a lot of this ill health that's coming to our attention, and that's not just a thing of Europe or North America. That seems to be a thing that's very generally true. Now, of course, for many diseases, dementia would be one that are affecting populations. We might say, well, we wouldn't really expect evolutionary considerations to be very relevant because the force of natural selection declines with age. So things that start to kill you by the time you're 75 probably have very little evolutionary relevance, simply because it's an observation known to, or made originally by George C. Williams in the 1960s. Natural selection isn't very good at dealing with things that start to happen after you've done most of your reproduction, because in effect, it can't see them. Of course, you might do a bit of grandparenting and things like that. It might make a difference, to your inclusive fitness, whether you were still in good shape to be a grandparent. But at an age when most of the population over previous centuries would have died, natural selection has no force, right? So we would expect, as life expectancies are increased through social and cultural means, to uncover a huge reservoir of disease that's just been sitting there, but selection has had no impact on. And to some extent, though not entirely, that may be true of things like dementia. But my point here is, this is not true of depression, right? Because depression, if you look at where the life years are lost, and depression is the blue curve on here, the onset is about the onset of reproductive capacity, in a big way. And actually the peak loss, or the peak morbidity, is exactly at the time when people are in midlife, they're having their kids, and so on, particularly amongst women. So, if this is a disorder, it's a disorder that evolution ought to have something to say about, right? Because this is the time when you're sort of achieving your reproductive output. So there's an interesting thing that something should be apparently so harmful, so prevalent, and acting exactly at the time of life. You think, natural selection would have acted on making people be well, even at the cost of possibly senescing later in life. Let's remind ourselves what we're talking about. These are the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria for major depression. The first two, as you know, are cardinal criteria that you have to have one of, which is either depressed mood. It seems rather circular that the symptom of depression would be depressed mood, but there you go. I think you all know what we mean, the emotional pain of overwhelming negative affect. Anhedonia, the loss of interest in previously pleasurable activities. And then at least some of the following list. I just want to draw attention to some features of this because it will become important, right? So there are things like changes in appetite or therefore body weight, changes in sleep, psychomotor changes, so either retardation, you can't drag yourself around, or agitation, you can't sit still, fatigue, loss of concentration, feelings of worthlessness or excessive guilt, and suicidal ideation. And for a DSM-5 diagnosis of depression, you have to have 5 of these, including one of the first 2. Couple of points to make. With the possible exception of suicidal ideation, I'm not sure about that one, all of these are quite normal. Okay, it would be a very strange person indeed who didn't occasionally lose a night's sleep or feel they couldn't get themselves out of bed in the morning. It would be a very strange person indeed who didn't feel fatigued sometimes. It would be a very strange person indeed who had days when they couldn't seem to concentrate, or days when they just felt blue, for example, loss of a spouse or something that Marcus has already mentioned. So that's the first thing. The second thing is there are bidirectional symptoms in there. Okay, so the sleep changes can either be that you sleep too much or that you don't sleep enough, or also that you sleep the right amount but at the wrong time of day. So actually it's quite a permissive sort of criterion. The appetite or weight changes can be either that you eat too much or you eat too little. So actually we start to see this as a pretty permissive syndrome. You have a set of things, all of which, with the possible exception of suicidal ideation, are actually normal, and some of which you don't even pre-specify which direction it will go. It'd be odd if a symptom of malaria will be either be too hot or you'll be too cold, right? I mean, that's not really how fever works. So already, we have a sense this is quite a curious sort of syndrome. Given that all of these are perfectly normal, what we rely on is something about the number of them and their severity to say that there's a disorder here. When you wouldn't, someone just feeling down for a day, you wouldn't yet say that they had a depressive disorder. I'll come back to that in more detail, but just already kind of flagged up some of the issues we're going to talk about. I'm not sure that this slide is perhaps as legible as I would have hoped, so I'll talk you through it. Are there evolutionary explanations for depression? Well, yes, there are plenty out in the literature, and I'm to some extent going over ground that Marcus has already touched upon. But let me just review them before I take a slightly more critical perspective on them. We've got a lot of evolutionary explanations out there in the literature, actually. Perhaps starting for no particular reason, one side of the circle. One key explanation is to do with sickness behaviour. So we know that animals that are suffering from infectious disease, or just are in a poor state otherwise, one of the things they do is they want to take themselves away and hide under a bush. They don't want to do anything, they don't want to eat, they don't want to exert themselves in any ways. And there's plenty of straightforward adaptations that what's going on there is that really the only useful thing you can do in that circumstance is let your immune system get on with the job. So don't expose yourself to anything else, don't expose your kin to whatever infection you've got. Don't try and do anything at a time when your energy just needs to be saved for mounting an immune response. And given the enormous growth in information that shows that depression in many people has a big immune component, you can see the link with sickness behaviour. So one of the leading evolutionary explanations for depression is to do with sickness behaviour and, as Marcus has already talked about, inflammation and immune system activity. There are also variants of that hypothesis out there in the literature that just more generally this is about saving energy, right? So for example, if you live in a world where you're very powerless, so this is not just to do with infectious disease, but more generally there may be times when you need to save energy, right? The weather conditions are poor for hunting. What can I do? Well, I can't go hunting, but I could save energy. The conditions for acting are unpropitious in whatever way. I'm powerless in a situation, or my somatic state is not up to the job, or simply I live in an autocorrelated world and the last time I did something that went badly, so rather than repeat it I wait until prevailing conditions improve. So there's a lot of hypotheses going back decades about the idea that this is a phenotype which is about sort of saving energy and so on. Related to that, I'm flipping around the circle a bit to the one that says managing risk-taking in adverse circumstances. So a related idea that I've written about and others have too is that animals, including human animals, are constantly having to make decisions about whether to seek new opportunities and goals, or stick with what they've got, whether to avoid potentially dangerous situations, or whether those are exactly the situations they should be going into. And you need kind of mechanisms that manage that take in information about what state am I in, and what stage is the environment in, that will tell me, is this a good time to be doing something risky? So by risky, there's in evolutionary biology, risk has a particular technical meaning, which is to do with the fact you don't know how things will turn out. They might turn out very well, or they might turn out quite badly. And there may be times when it's just not, it doesn't make sense. Circumstances are not propitious for you to take on new actions. And so maybe what depression is doing is saying, this is not a good time to act. You don't have the social support, or you don't have the energy, or the situation is too oppressive. So you need to keep your powder dry, and that would explain the pessimism, the anhedonia, the people's unwillingness to go and do things. Related to that, of course, at the core of depression is emotional pain. It's an aversive state, and it's certainly been argued in the literature that this is a state that firstly needs to be aversive because it's about learning. Okay, so when your partner leaves you, it feels awful. And one of the things that teaches you is to be nicer to your partners in future, or whatever, right? Or to navigate that particular, maybe choose different ones might also be another approach. But it teaches, things being valenced has an important function in learning theory, because we avoid that which is aversive by definition. So the negative affective valence of some of these symptoms may be to do with their role in learning, and therefore hopefully behaving more adaptively in future. And related to that, there's a specific hypothesis called the social navigation hypothesis of depression that kind of says, when things go badly wrong, you need to ruminate on why that is. You need to develop this mindset which kind of endlessly goes back through what you could have done differently, what things you might have been responsible for in the fact the situation turned out the way it did, and that rumination, which obviously we see as a pathological symptom of depression, but could be argued to be a kind of useful thing from that point of view. And similarly, depression is to do, causes people to disengage from sets of goals. And Randy Nesse, earlier in his career, wrote a lot about the idea that when people are depressed, what they do is disengage from a set of goals, and there might be times in people's lives where that's actually a good thing to do. So just finally, and without prolonging this too much longer, there's a bunch of hypotheses of depression which are about signalling. So one of the things, and particularly in the case of postpartum depression, this has been argued, is that depressed people are signalling to their caregivers, I need more investment here, I need more help here, I can't do this, look at me, I'm in pain, I'm crying, I'm unable to sort of complete this, you need to come and help. And of course, lack of social support is a major epidemiological risk factor for depression, so that's an interesting sort of hypothesis. So I just wanted to go through all that to give you a flavour of the idea that there's a bunch of ideas out there about how depression could be adaptive. And this literature, this evolutionary literature, I think varies in its intent from some of it, which is quite sort of, in a sense, quite anti-medical model, which is sort of saying that stuff that you're calling, a dysfunction is actually just the normal functioning of adaptations that are doing their job, right? So that's quite a radical critique of the sort of medical approach to depression, through to people who I think many of us in this room would be better, would fit this description, who fully accept that this is a medical disorder in at least some cases, but we're just trying to understand what kind of disorder it is and what normal functions it arises from, right? So where you are on the kind of over-medicalization question seems to me orthogonal to whether you're interested in these adaptive ideas. You could be interested in these adaptive ideas as a kind of source of where the maladaptive overexpression of these defenses comes from. Okay, so we've got a load of ideas about evolutionary functions of depression. I think there are a lot of issues with them. So the first one is that there are a lot of them, right? How do they all fit together? Which one's right? We don't know. I mean, the trouble is they all have a kind of prima facie plausibility about them. Oh, yeah, saving energy, you're right. Depressed people do save energy. Oh, yeah, well, signaling, they do signal, and so which is it, right? So in a sense, if everything we think of as an evolutionary explanation seems a good idea, as a scientist, that means we're on the wrong track. Okay, science is about finding the things in the world that are definitely not right, to leave that small set that might actually be right. So if everything we can come up with seems a pretty good idea, then I think we've got an epistemological problem. The other thing is, to my knowledge, there is really, so if you were to take a strong view and say depression is an adaptation, then you are committed to the claim that people who experience bad life events and develop depression have higher fitness or better outcomes than people who experience those same life events and don't have them, because the definition of an adaptation is something that improves survival and reproduction relative to not having it. And I just don't think we have any such evidence for the capacity for depression, right? I don't know of any study that says, you know what, people who get bereaved, depressed after they're bereaved, it's horrible at the time, but 20 years later they've got over it much better. I just don't know any evidence of that kind. And on the contrary, all of the evidence on depression is people who have bad life events and become depressed have a worse long-term follow-up than people who have bad life events but are resilient to them. Relatively resilient. Of course, they'll have, a transient reaction. Having an episode that meets sort of diagnostic criteria for depression is just really a predictor of A, you'll have other episodes in the future, and B, your physical health will be worse in the future, and it's actually a risk factor for all kinds of things like dementia. So this doesn't really fit with the idea that, it's nasty at the time, but a bit like fever, it's an adaptation, and actually the people who haven't got it are really, badly off. So that's a problem, right? If you're going to take a very strong adaptationist view of depression, I think the evidence just isn't there to support that. How can we save evolutionary ideas about depression? Well, I think there's a few ways we can do it. So a distinction that's already been made in the earlier discussion is to distinguish between low mood and depression, or Marcus called it depression and clinical depression, but however you want to cut that particular pie. And the idea goes here that you have a set of adaptations, which are the adaptations for low mood, and these are normal, right? These are things that all normally developing human beings have, and they're adaptive. It's, if your loved one would die and you wouldn't feel sad about it, you're not well equipped to navigate the social shoals of being an effective human, and that would be a bad thing. If you have high levels of inflammation and you don't get sickness behavior, then that would be bad. So what people have said, well, these adaptive explanations may apply to low mood, but then sometimes the low mood system goes wrong. And what you see in clinical depression is that the low mood system has gone wrong. Why might it go wrong? Well, there are genetic mutations, might make people vulnerable. There are various kinds of neurobiological malfunctions, and there are developmental malfunctions. Perhaps you're simply developing in an unfavourable environment. And then, of course, let's not forget there's just chance, right? These are complex systems, and they have to develop biologically in real time in a kind of sequential way, and sometimes they're just going to end up not working the way that they should. So on that view, there's this category of stuff, low mood, that's species typical, universal and adaptive, and there's this other category of stuff, depression, which happens when that system goes wrong. Now, I would find it, it's interesting, the conversation we had about hunter-gatherers and whether they have depression and so on. If this view is right, I'd be very surprised. I'm very sceptical of the claim that there's no depression amongst hunter-gatherers. It doesn't make any sense to me, right? I mean, those populations have genetic mutations, they have chance, developmental insults. Every human organ we've ever studied has gone wrong in some proportion of the population. So the idea that as long as you're living in a hunter-gatherer environment, your mood system couldn't go wrong seems to me crazy. Of course, the prevalence might be different. It might be much lower, and that could be a thing. But these are recurrent causes. There might be something about the modern environment that makes that pathology more likely to occur, and that would be interesting. But the idea that there wouldn't be any amongst hunter-gatherers makes no sense to me biologically. Okay, so that's fine. So I think that sort of symptom on the face of it gets us out of this bind and says, okay, depression is not an adaptation, we all agree that, but the capacity for low mood is. In the rest of my talk, I'm going to sort of get a bit more critical even about that view in a couple of different ways. The first thing is that though common sense tells us that this distinction between pathological depression and ordinary low mood exists, there's actually no empirical evidence that allows us to identify where it falls. Okay, so if you take a standard depressive symptom checklist, this is the GHQ, the General Health Questionnaire, and you just give it to the British population, in a way what you'd like to see is a bimodal distribution, right? There's this sort of group of people who've got a few symptoms because something bad's happened in their life, and there's this other group of people who've got pathological depression, and they'd be about 5 to 10% of the population, and they would have a different distribution. But there's an absolutely continuous distribution, okay? And there's actually, to my knowledge, no principal basis for putting the boundary anywhere in particular. So much so that, as you know, over the successive DSMs, the boundary has changed. So all of the, we know that all of the individual symptoms of depression, suicidal ideation may be a difficult one, but grant me that, occur transiently. They occur in quite a lot of the population. This thing about saying, well, if you've got 5 symptoms, you're depressed, and if 4 you've not, there's no particular empirical basis to that. It's just a kind of rule of thumb. And in fact, if you want to do things like, well, how could we validate our particular, diagnostic cut points? When we attempt to do that, it goes very badly generally. So, for example, if you identify depression using much looser criteria of just subclinical negative affect, that's just a good predictor of long-term outcomes such as physical health, risk of developing dementia and other things like that, as it is to have met the DSM 4 or 5 criteria. So there's really nothing about our current criteria that allows us to say, yeah, definitely there's something about the people who go over 5 or whatever. So although common sense tells me that must be right, there are people who whose mood systems are working just fine but have had a set of adverse experience, and there are other people whose mood system has gone wrong due to some chemical imbalance or something. The phenotypic data don't tell you where that is. And of course, the people with very high symptom scores there probably represent a mixture of these things. Some people have just had have terrible lives, really very bad life events recently. And some people, yes, maybe have a genetic vulnerability or something, but there's no real point of rarity between those things. In fact, what we know about developing human systems like the mood system is that they're very variable, right? They're variable across individuals. All human systems are the same. Some people have more active immune systems than others, and you'd expect some people to have more active low mood systems than others. You can't sort of find, obviously, from there the people who's gone wrong. Now, philosophically, what we think we're doing with these kind of things, and with things like DSM-5, of course, we don't literally believe that your mood system is working well until day 13 after your spouse leaves you, but it goes wrong on day 14. Though a strict interpretation of what the DSM says would say, on day 13 you're just a normal person, your low mood system's working fine, and day 14, it hasn't got better yet, you've developed a pathology. Now, we all accept that that's sort of arbitrary. We don't literally believe that. I suppose what we believe is that these arbitrary cut-offs probabilistically tell us about some unobserved state of the brain either being in pathology or not. But I'm just saying that there's no great neurobiological evidence or any kind of evidence that we've got those boundaries in the right place at the moment. And more than that, excuse me, different people who meet the criteria meet them in very different ways. So as I said, for a DSM-5 diagnosis, you have to have 5 of these symptoms. Now, given that there are about 8 or 9 symptoms there, it follows actually that, and especially given that 3 of the symptoms, you can have opposite phenotypes on them and still qualify, right? So we can have person A who has very blue mood, is putting on weight, sleeps all the time, is slowed down and feels suicidal, and person B who's anhedonic, losing weight, can't sleep, sped up, and can't concentrate. Those 2 people get the same diagnosis, right? In fact, they have no symptoms at all overlapping. So this is a real problem, and for reasons I'm going to come on and say. Also notice that many of the things on this list are on lists for other disorders too, right? So that's a further problem. So I'll kind of come on to why these things are problematic. I think they're problematic clinically, but they're also problematic from an evolutionary point of view, which I will come back to, I promise. This is just, actually Mark has already mentioned these studies, so and also I feel that the legibility is not very high, so I won't go into them in detail. This is just some famous studies that show different adverse life events produce different patterns of symptoms. Actually, the data, when you really start delving into them, are much less impressive than the abstract seems to make it sound like they're going to be, because actually there are quite a lot of symptoms that are common to all of the adverse life events, but there are some statistical differences. So, for example, after romantic loss, people routinely lose weight, and there are other kinds of adverse events that make people routinely gain weight. So there are these subtype differences. But here's what I wanted to talk about, because it's relevant both clinically and to the evolutionary stuff, which I'll come back to. What are we doing when we say that someone has depression? we're alluding to what we call in psychology a latent variable. That's something you can't directly observe, but which you infer on the basis of observable signs and symptoms. So if someone comes to you with anhedonia, fatigue, increased appetite and suicidality, you infer this underlying thing called their depression, okay? And that's sort of fine in a way. You need classificatory frameworks, and this is the one you use. But let's be careful of reifying that, because then we say the depression's what we want to treat. But the depression doesn't exist. You haven't observed it. What you've actually observed is anhedonia, fatigue, appetite, and suicidality. But you've inferred this latent variable, which you've then ascribed properties to. And this is significant because, as I've already told you, two different patients might come with entirely different sets of symptoms. In each case, you infer the same underlying latent variable because you've got this kind of many possible mappings to the latent variable of different probabilistic signs and symptoms. And what you then end up doing is, in your sort of the universe of things you might consider for treatment, is the universe of things that have been considered relevant for that latent variable depression, not the universe of things that's been considered found to be effective for that particular set of symptoms, which might be anhedonia and fatigue for one patient. There might be suicidality and insomnia for a different patient. So already that's telling you, by saying, oh, these are both cases of depression, I know how to treat depression, masks the fact that, in fact, you've got two different problems in front of you. We do this latent variable thing all the time in psychology, right? Just think about something like extroversion, right? We see people doing various behaviors. We infer this thing called extroversion. Then we go, oh, I've got this thing. Oh, this person's an extrovert. So now I understand why they do the things they do. But of course, the extroversion doesn't explain the behaviors, because you didn't know about the extroversion apart from the behaviour. So it would be entirely circular to claim that they explain the behaviours. Similarly, why is this person anhedonic and fatigued? Because they've got depression. How do I know they've got depression? Well, because they're anhedonic and fatigued, right? There's no explanatory purchase in that latent variable. Useful heuristically, though it might well be. There's an approach that's in clinical psychology is very much, sort of the current thing in the field called the symptomics approach or the network-based approach. Now, I don't know to what extent that's percolated into psychology, as I say, to psychiatry. In clinical psychology, it's the thing du jour. And I'll talk a bit about that. And there's a big debate about whether this is really just the emperor's new clothes or there's actually anything substantively different from what we all did anyway in this symptomics or network approach. The basic idea of the symptomics approach is you abandon the latent variable of depression altogether, except possibly as a kind of, useful kind of catch-all, but you don't assume that there is a real thing inside the person called their depression. What you say is, what symptoms do they have? So someone has fatigue and anhedonia, someone else might have some different symptoms. And what you understand is that those are the phenomena you seek to explain, and those are the phenomena you seek to treat, without arguing that they're signs and symptoms of some underlying thing you haven't yet observed. And crucially, in the symptomics approach, you allow the idea that symptoms have causal consequences for each other. So, for example, you might say, well, the anhedonia is actually caused by the fatigue, and the suicidality is caused by the anhedonia, right, or whatever, in which case, it would follow, the prediction would follow, that if you treated the fatigue, the anhedonia and the suicidality would go away. But what you're dealing with here is a case of fatigue. It's a case where the clinical imperative is to treat the fatigue, not to infer a latent variable and then apply the treatments that previously have been found effective for that particular latent variable. It's an important and subtle change. Because what it says actually is, it goes further down Marcus's road of saying there isn't one thing, there's 12 subtypes. It says we don't have to have any discrete and countable number of subtypes. What we have is people with problems. And we need to find out what problems they've got and in what combinations, right? And then we need to say, what's the evidence based on treatments that have been effective for people with those problems in those combinations. Okay. And I'm slightly conscious of time, but there's plenty of evidence, for example, that individual DSM symptoms have individually different risk factors. Again, the data is not as nice as it sounds like they ought to be when you start looking in detail. What does this symptomics approach give you? Well, what people do is that they take data on actual symptoms without regard for diagnostic categories, and they make these networks of them. And so what a network like this shows, this is from the National Comorbidities Survey, is this is the symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder and major depressive disorder in many thousands of patients, and the size of the node is the frequency of that symptom, or the prevalence of that symptom, and the strength of the edge, how bold it is how commonly those symptoms co-vary. And you can't probably see, but to the left-hand end is the symptoms of major depression, to the right-hand end are the symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder. So if these were really discrete disorders, what you'd hope was that there'd be a lot of bold edges among the symptoms on the left side and among the symptoms on the right side, and rather few edges, right, going between the two clusters, because the only people in whom the symptoms on the two sides would co-vary will be people who had both disorders. And actually what you find, this isn't true at all, that the symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder are often found with people who get the diagnosis of major depression and vice versa. So much so that we've known for ages that there's comorbidity between these two things, and actually the inter-rater reliability on whether, in the DSM-5 field trials, the inter-rater reliability on whether someone had generalized anxiety disorder or depression was very poor. It was such that it would be considered unacceptable in a psychology publication. So these things all go together, right? But they go together more often than the idea that there are discrete disorders suggests. But on the other hand, they don't go together often enough to say there's just one disorder. Right, because people don't have them all, actually, or they don't have them all to the same extent. So we need this intermediate position that says, actually, every individual has a different network of symptoms, and in different individuals, there might be different causal pathways from one symptom to another. So I think I possibly need to just slightly fast forward to make sure I can get in everything I wanted to say. So the kind of network I showed you on the previous slide, these are cross-sectional from many patients, but in a way the idea of the symptomics approach in the long term, the sort of ideal of it, is that you would develop causal networks of symptoms in an individual patient, in which the edges represented the strength of the causal influence in that patient from one symptom to another. How you do that's difficult, but we can come back to that. So these might be different, like for the patient on the left, on the right, and the way you would want to treat things depends on your understanding of what the keystone symptoms in that community are, and the ones that have kind of causal knock-ons for the other things. Let's come back to our evolutionary perspective a bit. I think this sort of shifts the emphasis rather from saying, okay, we need to explain this thing called depression, or saying, okay, well, we don't explain that, we need to explain this thing called low mood. What are the actual entities we want explanations for? Well, on this approach, they're just the symptoms themselves. Why would humans have a capacity for fatigue? That's not very difficult. Why would humans have a capacity for anhedonia? Well, it's not very difficult to think of cases why that might be true. Why would humans have a capacity for suicidality? That is a bit more challenging, I admit. Why would people sometimes not be able to sleep? Well, it's very easy to think of kind of adaptive situations about that. We know that animals don't sleep so well, for example, when they're in high predation environments. Why would people sometimes want to sleep more? Well, you sleep more when you recover from an illness. So the individual symptoms are not very hard to explain. I think the other thing we need to mount an explanation for from an evolutionary perspective is the linkages between symptoms, right? Because although I've said every one of these networks will be different for different patients, there will be statistically at the population level more common linkages than others. So for example, sleep problems and fatigue are really no surprise, but they're really well linked. But if you take that seriously and say, okay, well, if in fact I'm going to be sort of literal about the symptoms I'm being presented with, then treat sleep problems. Okay. Similarly, people's I think this sort of rather changes your view from saying that there's this kind of thing called their depression, which is hidden in there somewhere if I can only find it, to saying this is someone who's got a whole list of problems, but at the head of that list is that they can't sleep. Then actually you treat their insomnia, and you make a strong prediction that a load of downstream things would kind of change. So understanding from an evolutionary point of view which are the important causal linkages, and I think there's one from inflammation to sickness behaviour, there's one from sleep problems to fatigue. I mean, understanding what these individual links are is enormously helpful in terms of thinking about therapeutic strategies, and it's more helpful in my view than trying to think of evolutionary explanations for diagnostic categories that we ourselves as researchers are kind of sticking on to what are in effect networks of phenomena. How much time have I got? Can you just remind me?
You have about 10 minutes left before the Q&A.
Perfect. Okay, I will go relatively fast through this last bit. Let me just briefly come back to, so on this view where there are just symptoms and edges, do we need this notion that there's normal low mood and maladaptive depression? I think yes, probably. We kind of still do end up with some sort of notion of that distinction. Perhaps it's rather different. I think the view that's being pushed by these symptomics people is that symptoms are complex dynamical systems. Okay, so there might be, for example, feedback loops that sleep causes fatigue, and sleep problems causes fatigue, and fatigue causes anhedonia, but anhedonia causes sleep problems, right? So you can get these kind of perfect storms. So what you get is a dynamical system where the causality is actually flowing around and unfortunately coming back and eating its own tail sometimes. And what we know about complex dynamical systems is even ones with relatively small number of nodes have multiple stable states, at least if certain things are true about them. That's to say, is they might normally be homeostatic, that you push on one symptom, the whole system kind of creeps over there because of the causal linkages among symptoms, but because of negative feedback loops, it does eventually sort of push itself back, and so most people's depression is self-limiting actually on the individual episode basis, but similarly, when something bad happens in your life, you have multiple kind of effective reactions to that, but it is, does tend to be self-limiting. But something we know about complex dynamical systems is they do get sometimes pushed into different states, right? A state where you could imagine if you had a particularly strong jolt to one symptom, that could set up a positive feed forward loop that would keep that system for a long time in a state where where it's not designed to be. So I think you end up with this notion of pathological depression, but as a kind of a case where a complex dynamical system has been perturbed for whatever reason in such a way that it's gone into an alternative stable state. And then you need to understand what are the symptoms that are going to sort of help me get back to homeostasis. I'm just in interest of time, I'm not going to sort of dwell on this, but I've written about mood, and actually the idea that the various kind of perturbations of the mood system we talk about could be these alternative, as it were, these alternative states of a complex dynamical system. I think it's not just depression and generalized anxiety disorder, which are respectively the state where reward systems and pleasure systems are turned down, and the state where systems for detecting threats are turned up. But also we need to talk about things like dysphoric mania, which is where people actually the reward systems are absolutely charging away and people are looking for stuff to do, but at the same time they feel awful because their punishment threat detection systems are also very activated, and also euphoric mania where people are charging around seeking rewards. We can think of these as these sort of alternative temporarily stable states of this complex dynamical system. In view of time, I won't be able to talk much about this, but there's some really interesting work that's using within patient longitudinal data to try and understand these systems. And it turns out that for example, in remitted depressive patients, you can begin to predict. So what they do in these studies is they give people a bleeper, and they poll them, frequently at random intervals to say, how are you feeling right now? Are you feeling tired right now? Are you feeling happy right now? Are you feeling worried right now? And so they treat each of these worriedness and sadness and tiredness and sleepiness and so on. They treat each of these as a kind of node and build the network of how those things predict each other over time. And you end up with a lot of data for every individual person, but you can actually predict when patients are going to remit because the oscillations and in particular the couplings in these networks start to change. So whereas in sort of a healthy state, we might all have these fluctuations, but they return relatively quickly, and also a fluctuation on one of the axes, say sadness, doesn't have big implications for a fluctuation on the other one. As you're going towards an episode, those linkages start to be stronger, so the prediction from one symptom or one affective rating to another start to be stronger, and the autocorrelation starts to be bigger, so that when it gets perturbed in one direction, it starts to be slower to come back, and then eventually, I suppose, ex hypothesi in the episode itself, it's going there and staying there. Have a look at that paper. It's very interesting stuff about really what's going on at the individual level. So I've got one more bit after this. This is a sort of interim summary, but I'll do it quickly. So maybe, if this view is right, the entities in need of evolutionary explanation is not depression, or perhaps not even low mood, but the individual components, fatigue, vigilance, etc. And I don't think those are very difficult to explain. But also the causal linkages between symptoms, and also between things we don't consider symptoms of depression and depression. So for example, inflammation, chronic stress, all these things which we don't consider symptoms of depression. I think we need to have a completely open mind about whether the sort of causes need to be sought on the psychological level, at all. I think, the mind and the body have no natural boundary between them, and I think infectious disease is a cause of depression. I think that autonomic nervous system changes, I think changes in physical activity, changes in diet. We have to consider all of these things as possibilities of things that perturb that system. So we need to understand the causal linkages between symptoms and also between non-symptoms, i.e. causes and symptoms. Quite a lot of these symptoms have animal counterparts and are individually well studied. When people say, I've got a mouse model of depression, they almost never have. What they've got is a mouse model of one symptom of depression. And so actually, we already know quite a lot about them. I do believe that much of what we label as depression and anxiety represent the normal functioning of this network in the face of environments that, let's face it, are often pretty adverse. And ultimately that is, a homeostatic thing. People who on average experience worse environments will experience more depressive symptoms. But it doesn't mean they'll have depression episodes as such. But ultimately I do believe it is a homeostatic network in most cases. But disorder, whatever we take that to mean, does arise for all kinds of reasons, possibly including that the contemporary environment does not contain certain regularly occurring features of the kind of environments we've more typically lived in that ensured a homeostatic return to the sort of most frequent stable state. Physical activity, I think, is a great one, right? So no one was really built for a world where it will be possible to not be physically active for long periods of time. And it may be that having to get up and do that because you needed to, was a way of kind of interrupting one stable state of that network and returning it. Okay, final point. For me, what's the benefit of the evolutionary perspective on all this? I just would like to sort of state, though I can't elaborate, I don't think evolution helps you necessarily very much with thinking about medicine, but I think it helps you a lot with thinking about public health. Okay, and most of the people, if you wanted to reduce the prevalence or the incidence of depression, you have to understand that most of the people who are going to become depressed next year are going to come from the population that's healthy this year. So treating the people who are already depressed is never going to do it for you, right? You've got to stop them turning up. And so a lot of the things that affect the states of this system are already well known. Poverty, social isolation, physical inactivity, pollution, Marcus mentioned, food insecurity, poor working conditions and lack of job control, shift work, things that mess with your sleep, right? So these are not narrowly medical issues, these are public health issues, and they spin out into public health policy. And one of the things for me that the evolutionary approach buys you is not so much it says, which bit of the brain you need to look at, is it says, well, what's a decent environment for a human being to live in? So if you really believed about reducing suffering and ill health, let's spend a lot of our effort on trying to make those environments, and then hopefully we'll have to spend a bit less on sort of curing the problems that are downstream of that. I know that's controversial and maybe a topic for another day, but I think my cue has come to stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would say I agree about the public health rather than the simplistic treatment of one individual. So I don't think that's actually that controversial.
No,
I think the college itself has looked at a lot of things. George might help us.
So thank you very much. Very interesting. Just a couple of questions. One, simple. Why do you say suicidal thoughts are not normal? And secondly, would you say that your approach is quite typical of psychology, in the sense that we were talking earlier today during Dr. Wren's talk about different levels of meaning and sociability? I trained in group analysis, and one of the ideas there is taking the non-problem seriously as a therapeutic approach.
So thank you for that. When I said that suicidal thoughts or not normal. I actually don't know statistically what their distribution is in the population, and in the sort of so-called healthy population, how frequent are they, and so on. I simply don't know much about that. I suppose I merely meant that from a sort of unconsidered evolutionary point of view, things like fatigue are very easy to understand, but things like suicidality are a little more puzzling on the face of it. So that's all I meant. I'm not saying that you couldn't show that in fact they were more broadly distributed and also had some sort of reliable generator that could be understood. I should stress this wasn't particularly my approach. I just put it together through this talk, but the network approach is very much in the psychological tradition of viewing difference dimensionally rather than categorically, but I think goes beyond that with this idea of networks of symptoms. And psychologists love to classify psychiatrists as being, very discrete, kind of everything's in a box way, which in practice always turns out to be unfair to the psychiatrist. But yes, this is more of a psychological approach. Most psychiatrists I talk to say, look, I have no problem with any of this, but we need some labels, we need to communicate with each other, and that's why we have these kind of... So it's really about not abolishing the labels, but just remembering that the labels are conveniences.
Thank you.
Nikhil? Sorry.
Thank you, Daniel. I take your point that you warned us not to be drawn into being over-adaptiveness.
Yes.
But what would you say about the cognitive symptoms of depression, like memory loss and lack of concentration? I mean, it's really hard to argue a resource-saving feature of those symptoms, which are quite common. And actually, even when we treat all of the other symptoms, we can't really treat those problems, and they cause more and more problems. So it's clearly not adaptive. So what would you say in terms of evolutionary?
Well, what I would say is that there are constraints, right? Organisms have sort of finite energetic resources. So I think that often what's happening in depression is that simply the burden of other stuff that's going on detracts resources from the brain's ability to do. So there's no positive adaptive function of those things. But so, for example, we know amongst ultra marathon runners that their cognitive abilities at the ends of these long runs are really, really down, and there's no positive adaptive reason. It's just that the feat has so sapped them that there just isn't any energy left to allocate. So I guess I would go down that kind of route of a sort of byproduct thing. Now, the interesting thing about that might be you sort of deal with the other symptoms and it's a while for those things to come back. I do believe that they can come back, though I guess that's an empirical question. So I think some of the symptoms, rather than saying, there's an adaptive function for this, it's just you can't manage to do certain things whilst other stuff is going on, I guess.
Thank you. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sorry?
No, gentleman behind you.
Oh, hello, my name's Charlie Shuttleworth. I'm a working age adult psychiatrist. Thanks very much for an interesting talk. I just wanted to make one comment because you were talking about symptoms and symptomics, and I was just aware, I can't remember exactly which study it was, but it was based on the STAR-D interventions, and they did look at symptoms, and then they used a machine learning algorithm, basically, to subdivide the patients who obviously had treatment-resistant depression, and then very much data-driven. It wasn't theory-driven, but it then was able to say, actually, for this particular symptom cluster, this particular intervention might work. So I think there have been some forays into that, and there was even moves to then even primary care having a sort of working algorithm that physicians could actually start putting symptoms in without having much theoretical background or sort of competency without comprehension, kind of very much along the evolutionary line.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, and so if I seem to come across as saying everyone has these very simplistic, discrete diagnostic boxes, I apologise, because I'm just saying I think that's the route we need to go down. Actually, yeah.
No, got it. You're on my list, Marcus.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for a fascinating talk. I just wanted your comment about reproductive success and depression.
Yes.
it seemed to me from a large study by Power et al., I think 2013, is that JAMA or something, somewhere like that, I think it's JAMA, where depression stood out as the only major psychiatric disorder that did not involve reduced reproductive success. Men had 90% of reproductive success of the general population, and women 100%.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Whereas all the other conditions, I mean, schizophrenia was the worst.
Yeah.
Where which was like men had 20% or something, where women 40%, and all the others were slightly higher. But depression, almost no reduction in reproductive success. Comments?
That's very interesting. I didn't know that particular fact. I knew in schizophrenia that there have been these kinds of studies and it's always been very low, but I didn't know that fact about depression, so that's very, very interesting. I suppose that typically the course of depression is much more remitting than schizophrenia and much more episodic, and so you could see how that could come about. But I mean, what that I don't. Let's not make too much of it. But what it possibly says is that people who end up having that diagnostic label may be pretty normal. They may just have a run of bad events, as it were, and therefore we know that its course is much different from that of a psychotic disorder. But that's very interesting. Thank you for that.
Just like to add to that we've spoken about this quite a lot.
Yes.
Sorry, yes, I'm over here, about it being a sort of normal experience, maybe in extremis, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try and alleviate the suffering.
No, that's a good point.
Because people get quite cross with evolutionary psychiatrists for saying it's normal, therefore you don't have to do anything. Yeah. That's not what we're saying.
No, thank you for that, and you reminded me. I didn't sort of say that at any point, but I mean, all this symptomic stuff is new to me, and it's not something I've personally written about. It's just what I've been reading about recently. My understanding of the symptomic stuff is it's not deconstructive of the idea that people have real medical problems. It merely says you treat the symptom profile that turns up, and so if people are presenting, with a more anxious, agitated presentation, you need to listen to that, and I mean, you could go further with it and then say, well, why would that be? What's been happening to you that this is how you find, but. No, absolutely not. Right? The alleviation of suffering still remains the goal here, I think. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Marcus.
I think it's important to note that if you want to understand whether any behavior of animals is adaptive, you should study it in the environment where that adaptation was evolved. So if we study modern humans, we live in so different environment that we are not able to understand whether any trait was adaptive when it evolved, and that makes that very difficult to understand. And if you want to explain depression, should not be able to depress only in humans but in all animals. So we would need a general theory which fits empirical evidence, not only in humans but in also other animals. I tried to do it. It's very difficult, but let's hope that someday we will find that. But only looking symptoms won't help because the data collected among modern humans won't tell much about what happens millions of years ago when those adaptations did emerge.
Absolutely, of course you're right. I suppose if you hope that we might develop a causal understanding of how these things are linked to each other, that presumably reflects the evolved system. I appreciate that doesn't tell you how it associated with reproductive success in the past and so on, but I believe that you can develop a causal understanding of how different psychological phenomena relate in modern humans. Just because they're living in a weird environment doesn't stop you doing that necessarily. What you can't understand is what the natural history would have been, and that's where hunter-gatherer studies are valuable, but few and difficult to do.
Is this on?
Yes, it is, yeah.
Clearly.
Much of what's been said is about the individual's fitness, resilience and susceptibility and how that relates to the environment. But I wondered if there was anything to be said about the group fitness, susceptibility and resilience, and what might be advantageous for the individual might not be for the group, and vice versa.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, that's, you've sort of let off a rocket there. You may not have realised, but the whole idea that groups are things that have fitness is very controversial in evolutionary biology, and I think the general consensus is they only do under certain very restrictive conditions, namely where there's very little migration between groups, and therefore what ends up is the individuals within groups tend to end up very related to each other and not closely related to individuals in other groups. The general thought is that groups throughout human evolution have been very fluid and with lots of fission and fusion, and that doesn't lend itself to a situation where the notion of group fitness really has an interpretable meaning. So, I mean, I think to talk about the fitness of a colony of bees or wasps is perfectly fine, and indeed makes a lot of sense, right? Because their lot is bound up together. But for a highly mobile fission fusion species like humans, the idea that there is a thing like group fitness is very controversial amongst evolutionary biologists. I have my own prejudices on the subject, and Marcus may have different views than me, but I'll leave that there. Ultimately, reproductive success is, it's individuals that reproduce. A society doesn't have a baby, an individual does. So the notion of fitness at the group level, it's unclear what that means. It would be clear in a bee or a wasp, because there are queens, and that's a different matter.
But there are other sorts of reproduction and other things that influence reproductive success, and ideas can also reproduce.
Absolutely. So if you're talking about cultural evolution, then that's a different matter. Also, what I said doesn't in any way imply that societies aren't important to our well-being, right? That the property of the society we live in is fantastically important to the well-being of every one of us. It's just that the technical notion of fitness, which is a notion in evolutionary biology, doesn't have an interpretation when groups are of the nature of human groups. Yeah.
Lastly, Nikhil, and then we'll break for coffee.
Yeah, thanks for that. I really, really loved that talk. I was euphoria manic during it. And I think you said something, you just really well articulated something, as you say. Most of us here know that this is a category, these are words, and we're sort of using them as shortcuts to describe phenomena. And that can be very useful I really like the idea of making that boundary when someone's locked in a sort of self-perpetuating dynamic network of systems. So I see how it's very useful for treatment. One problem I'm having all the time, especially with my students at the moment, who come and ask me things about, well, what does this mean if, the sort of evolutionary interpretations that you went over. It was a philosophical talk, right? So in medicine, that boundary, we can decide where that boundary should be, but the sort of free will connotations and philosophical implications of this are huge, right? And now, whilst it's great that we're increasing awareness about mental health problems, people are being like, oh, there's something wrong with my brain, and therefore this is excusable, when really, the distinction between someone who's in jail and due to depression, or someone who's in jail because they're a bit moody, is an arbitrary one. How do we balance, when students are asking me, or when people are trying to communicate this, how do we balance the benefits of the medical benefits of categorization and getting people to seek treatment, and then this misinterpretation that you've got a pathology which is due to neuroanatomy, but all other personality characteristics are, completely independent, and it's a can of worms. But I'd love to hear what you.
Well, I think, as you say, it is a can of worms. I think it's very interesting, and I think the difference between, the other species Marcus is talking about and humans is that humans have an awareness of the availability of a diagnostic category, right? And I think that in itself changes the phenomena. I mean, for someone who's as biologically oriented as me, this is a dangerous concession to make, but it's true that people, when you make available an interpretative framework for the kinds of adverse experiences people are having, people have different experiences that then fit their available frameworks of meaning, right? And I think we know that humans do that. So it's a problem, and I've really no idea how we solve that. I'm very worried how many people, some extraordinary proportion of US children have a disorder, are deemed to have a disorder of some kind or another. I mean, an order of magnitude greater than was true 2 generations ago. And I think that's because there are a lot of adverse experiences. So some of those are recurrent, some of those are to do with particular social and other arrangements now, and people are finding ways to, make sense of those, and the medical framework's the one we've got. So it is a matter for real concern. I've got no good answer, but something I will say is something I like about the evolutionary approach, and what I always sort of tell my students is evolution is about variation, and they don't get this. They think evolution is about this is how you should be, and I say, if you read the first 100 pages of Darwin's, on the origin of species, it's about how pigeons are really different from each other, and none of them is not a proper pigeon. They're all like normal pigeons, but they're just really varied. And I kind of keep saying, well, evolution is going to produce a sort of spectrum of variation. And so for me, that can be a valuable thing to say, look, these things are kind of sort of vary a bit from individual to individual because it's complex, and also because that's what evolution does. It's about population thinking, understanding that there's continua of variation. That fails to answer your question, but...
I'm thinking about the judicial system. I know Paul says, I'm not a psychiatrist, but in the DSM at the start, it says something about this shouldn't have any implications on the legal system. The judge isn't a psychiatrist, and more we're seeing this invoked. How do you think that?
Well, I'm going to call a halt there because we've got a coffee break now for 15 minutes. And thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you, everybody.